Hello, everybody. My name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy&Future. And today, my guest is Dr. Phillip Karber. Hi, Phil. How are you?
Hey, Jacek. How are you?
We're going to talk, of course, about Ukraine and the battlefield of Ukraine. But before we start, let me introduce my guest. And today, our guest is really an extraordinary guest. The list of, merits is very long, but let me just make it really brief. So the president of the Potomac Foundation, the Georgetown University adjunct professor, right, teaching international law and strategy, National Security Council staff during the Cold War. During the Cold War, in the Reagan administration, head of strategy for Pentagon, directly reporting to the Secretary of Defense. I also found a lot of stuff about you doing, nuclear stuff, but I
don't believe everything you read.
Yeah. Advisor to Margaret Thatcher during the Cold War and Secretary General of NATO as well. Many other things. But speaking of Ukraine, starting from 2014, you co-penned the famous report with former NATO commander General Wesley Clark on to President Obama. And most importantly, in the context of the discussion we're going to have tonight, you were with the Ukrainian troops from 2014 onwards on more than 100 times in the field. I was told that you were even wounded. You may expand a little bit, and you were, sort of in the engagement zone with the Russian troops. At least this is what the people say. So the legend and the best guy to talk to in terms of, what we see in Ukraine, the performance, the battlefield. And on my personal note, that's the great person to talk to in terms of the warfare. So hello again, Phil, after this introduction. Let's get started. Let me show the map that you requested at the beginning. Can you see it?
Yeah. So okay. I thought your viewers might find it useful to kind of get some perspective on things. So this is where things were basically in December or beginning of this year, January 1st of this year. That was the Ukrainian army, and they were that was their peacetime locations. The units were sending battalion tactical groups to various threatened sectors. The Russians were preparing assets along the Belarusian border, but yet and were conducting an exercise with Belarusians, but had not started. And I want to emphasize there's a lot of people are surprised at how well the Ukrainian forces have at least withstood the onslaught. So a couple sort of introductory things I want to show is both why they've done better than people expected, and also how the Russians have massively reinforced their forces and made it much more problematic. So the next slide I'd like to show you is comparing Ukrainian forces to the last 10 members to join NATO. You have that slide, Jacek.
Can you see it?
Not yet. It should be the chart. It should chart.
Yeah. Hold on.
So what Jacek's looking for it. There we go. What's interesting about this chart is people say, well, Ukraine's not ready for NATO. Ukrainian forces, as of January 1st of this year, surpassed the total amount of forces NATO had in the last 10 countries to join NATO. Why is that important? Well, for one thing, the NATO's criteria for saying Ukraine's not ready was frankly,
they were as ready as anybody. Yeah.
May I say bullshit? It was a political BS. The Ukrainians had adopted as many NATO standards than more than half of the guys on this chart. Moreover, if you look at this, it should raise a very serious issue. If Ukrainian forces can't hold given their size and quality and combat experience, is this force of NATO sufficient once Ukraine falls? Next slide.
Yeah, but it's true. If I may challenge, this
Yeah.
this approach a bit, and I will maybe not even disclosing my own opinion, but the people sometimes, the common wisdom, as we say, conventional wisdom, is that people were looking at the Ukrainian state, that it was corrupted and weak and poor and so on. So you know how it works. People perceive also the military as corrupted, weak, and thinned out or something.
Right.
And they were complaining quite a lot about low morale. The perception was, and that's why people are surprised now that they are, putting out the fight. So what was
let's talk about the corruption for a second. There's a joke going around Washington now. If NATO will root out all the corrupt politicians who are on the pay of Moscow and have their army as motivated as the guys now fighting, NATO will be allowed to join Ukraine.
I understand. But
there was an enormous block of self-deception. So we allowed some countries like Hungary, whose president is a buddy of Putin's and brags about being a buddy of Putin's, Germany, whose senior members are literally on the payroll of Russian economic entities, and we gave them the right to blackball somebody who probably could have, should have been involved, and could have stood much stronger had we helped them. Part of this is American fault, because the United States under Obama took the attitude, oh, we're going to lead from behind. Because the feeling was under previous Republicans, we've been too pushy on NATO, too pushy on the Europeans for getting involved in the Middle East and so forth, the war on terror. Okay, so we're going to lead from behind. Well, you don't lead from behind. It's like managing cats. It's the lowest common denominator when you lead from behind. The Trump administration, there were a number of good guys in it, including General McMaster, who the first national security advisor to Trump, who got it. They were the ones who got the first lethal javelin weapons into Ukraine. But Trump himself was in la la land, if not compromised politically with Putin. And now the new administration comes in, and they're hoping to have, they felt like they needed to try to have a relationship with Russia, so we didn't have a new strategic arms race. There's this joke going around Washington, by the way, that in Biden's first meeting with Putin, Biden goes, "Oh, Vladimir, my number one priority, domestic and international, is global warming, and I really would like to enlist your help and ask you to help us out." Vladimir thinks about it for a minute. "No problem. I start the Cold War."
Yeah.
So part of it was our own self-deception. And ironically, so then the next thing is we said, well, okay, we will not put boots on the ground. We will not send weapons to Ukraine. Saying that ahead of time, of course, took all the uncertainties out of Russian planning. But think of how crazy it is that we don't start sending them the weapons to defend themselves until the shooting starts. So
which is very late.
It's absolutely miraculous. Excuse me, but it's absolutely miraculous that all of a sudden now the Russians attack, and we've opened up the arm, and we're sending it like as much as we can. Little Estonia sending them. Everybody's joining in, right? Even Germany says, "Oh yeah, we changed our mind overnight, and now we're going to start providing lethal aid," and it's appreciated. It's important. Switzerland has said, "Oh, we decided we're not going to be neutral anymore." Okay, but it's too fucking late. It's too damn late. It takes time to get those weapons into Ukraine. It takes time to get them distributed, if you can even reach them, to the guys who need them most in combat. it takes time for sophisticated weapons like javelin or stinger to have even a modicum of training. The reason I seem so emotional about it is a good friend of mine, General Sodol, a great Ukrainian commander, is currently commander of their Marine Corps. And they're surrounded now in Mariupol, and they're going down with a fight. And I just heard them and they don't have javelins as far as Mariupol. They don't have stingers at Mariupol. Why? Because we sent them too late, and shame on us. I'm sorry, but I really have had it up to here with that NATO self-congratulation and moral turpitude.
For sure, it didn't deter Russians. They didn't create ambiguity in terms of the U.S. intentions. Yeah, so they could do what they wish. But still they encounter resistance. So how did that work, Doc? They didn't mobilize on time. It seems that they didn't manipulate the terrain on time, especially from the northern axis. Right. The manning was not perfect. So how did it work out that they stopped it in a way, as they did?
Well, so if you go to the next set of slides, if you can, the one that shows the deploying units from the Far East. So the slide that I first showed where the Ukrainian forces were and where the Russians were, well, the Russians realized that they did not have sufficient forces to take on the Ukrainians. So they decided to reinforce them. And this slide shows where all the units are coming from. So they basically activated the assets from Murmansk, from the Sixth Guards Army opposite the Baltic. 5 armies in the Far East were deployed, and those forces went primarily to Belarusia. The 2 armies in the central of Russia, the second, what used to be the Second Tank Army, and the 41st Army. The 41st Army was moved to the north side of Kiev. We'll come back and talk about them. Down in the south, the 58th Army was reinforced heavily into Crimea. The places where the Russians brought in a total of about 120 battalion tactical groups for the initial slot. By the way, they've now committed close to 90% of those, but maybe a little bit more.
So let's recap.
Let me just describe those battalion tactical groups for 1 second, Jacek, and then we'll go. So back in 2019, in 1999, Second Chechen War, Putin was a prime minister, not president yet. And one of his innovations was they realized that sending conscripts who were not well trained, who didn't want to be there, who took disproportionate casualties, and whose mothers got upset. So they said, okay, we're only going to take and send professionals, meaning what they call contractors, to these war zones. So, which is what they did, and it succeeded in the Second Chechen War in 1999. They also worked reasonably well in Georgia with some problems, mainly that they didn't have enough forces prepared and they went too fast. But nonetheless, the concept of the battalion tactical groups worked. So they liked the battalion and they then introduced battalion tactical groups into Ukraine in 2014, and they again has some problems, and I'll come back to the problems. But they introduced them. So getting ready for this conflict, the Russians then brought in these 100, so they had about 60 battalion tactical groups surrounding around Ukraine. Well, Ukraine had about the equivalent of close to 60 battalion tactical groups. 40 of them were regular forces, about 20 of them required reserve mobilization to fill out and flesh out their assets. But half of the Russian force was truly professional or elite, like Spetsnaz, airborne, air assault, or units that were 100% contractors. The second slot of 60 battalion tactical groups they had decided to increase that number. So a battalion tactical group takes a brigade and takes the best part of the brigade from the four maneuver units of the artillery, air defense, and puts them all in one sort of super battalion. So, and they had that, but they could only afford to have about totally 80 of those in the entire Russian army. So they said, well, we want more. So they said, we're going to double the number. Well, they didn't double the number of, or they didn't increase the number of professionals in the army. So they had a problem. So what they did is they would take young conscripts and say, hey, we'll pay you more if you'll stay in, and you're now a contractor, and you're now a professional. But they're really not. They've been there 2-3 years. They're young guys. They're not trained killers like the other guys. So when we see those forces come into Ukraine, you're getting very mixed results. Some of the units the Russian units are doing extremely well, and others are clearly having not only problems, but even morale and falling apart. One last issue. If you look at where the Russians are making their major breakthroughs, they had learned that battalion tactical groups are great to do penetrations, but they don't have a weight of sustaining attack, and they don't have the logistic support to stay in attack. That's why General Zabrowski, the Ukrainian famous general in 2014, had conducted his counterattack and literally wiped a bunch of them out. So they said, okay, so we have to have bigger units. Well, they couldn't afford a whole bunch of bigger units, relatively fully manned, but they did build some, usually one in each of the major armies. And it's those divisions units that are now making the most progress, again, in the north, in the east, and in the south.
So it seems that BTG concept didn't work against the foe like Ukraine in terms of the distance and the sustainment of attack and so on, right? Because
it works if it's handled by professionals, and if on the key axes of attack they have the weight of a full brigade, or actually a full division. So they have the artillery support, they have the logistics, they have the medical evacuation, the reconnaissance of these larger units. Then they work, but by themselves they tend to get cut up and isolated, and if they're have these younger kind of thaw contractors, that they do not have the same morale or staying power as professionals.
Yeah. Plus, I understand that because they lack the real infantry, so they cannot control the connectivity hubs that they move past, and they simply do not control the terrain that they have just transited. Right? How does that work? That
in some cases, but remember, they also mobilized 100,000 of their interior security forces, who are echelon and have the responsibility of actually doing the occupation of cities and control of lines of communication. They also had, Kardia, the crazy Chechen who betrayed his own people and sided with Putin, and has committed 40,000 Chechens to a special security force in Russia. Those were some of the lead guys who tried to break into Kiev, by the way, and assassinate President Zelensky and key members of the deal, and were stopped by the Ukrainian Alpha Group. But there's about 10,000 of those Chechens who are, and their orders are to go into areas where there is resistance, and they are very nasty guys. I've seen actually videos of them cutting a guy's heart out and playing ball with it, while the other guys are sitting there watching them do this, eating their lunch. They're very nasty guys, and they have now been assigned the mission. And this is U.S. intelligence warning this, of going in and taking any resistance leaders in Ukraine and lining them against the wall and publicly shooting them or torturing them, and so forth. So there's a very nasty element there.
So what do you think? How do you assess the Russian war plan in terms of the, I think, opening stages when they apparently wanted to terminate the war quickly by moving on Kiev? How would you assess, this?
So by the way, just as a little bit of timeline, it's pretty evident now that the beginning of this, the implementation of this plan, maybe it goes back quite a ways, but the implementation of this plan began in September 2020, when Putin finally had enough coercive leverage on Lukashenko. And Lukashenko sat there in the meeting with Putin and said, okay, I commit the Belarusian forces and to be integrated with the Russian army. And that's when they began the planning for this. It was interesting in the following December of 2020, the first discussion of Zapad exercise 2021 publicly came out of Belarus, not Russia. Then in January, February, as they were preparing they were doing the first stages of preparation for Zapad 2021, they were actually exercising against the Baltic, air attacks on Sweden, plans for potential attack on Poland. Then in March and April, it switched to preparing assets down in the Crimea, in the Black Sea. They brought in naval infantry and landing ships from the Sea, Caspian Sea and the Sea of Azov, and they brought in lead elements from the 58th Army in the Caucasus up into Crimea with heavy artillery and so forth. Then, so that over the next few months, they continued to practice. Then they did Zapad 21 exercise in September. This was essentially the exercise getting ready for the game plan. Interestingly, only a fraction of those forces were actually put into Belarus. And at the time, it was sort of weird because you said, well, if they're doing all this big thing with Belarus, why aren't they putting more? Well, that was also the cover plan for getting the Russian forces in the Western military districts down into offensive position. That then was essentially completed. And somewhere at the end of September, early October, U.S. intelligence got a copy or advance warning of a Russian plan for a full invasion of Ukraine. At first, people couldn't believe it.
The full, you mean the whole territory invasion?
The whole territory.
Mm-hmm.
Not taking pieces of it. So we sent the head of our intelligence to Moscow and said, are you guys, are you serious? We're getting indications of this. What's going on? And in essence, they told them, yep, we haven't decided yet, but that's an option we're definitely playing. So then the U.S. over the next few months was warning and saying, oh, they're doing this. And each month, each week, another shoe would drop, more units would move, and so forth. But that was in the forward area. So they got the guys placed in and around in the western and southern military districts around Ukraine, and coming in some guys from the north. And then come January was the movement of all those forces from the Far East, including air reinforcement into Belarus. So now go to the next slide, if you would, which shows what they did with the Iskander missiles. So the Russians only had about 3 or 4 of their Iskander brigades within range of targets in Ukraine prior to the conflict. And what they did is they brought these Iskander missiles in so that over 100 launchers were within range of Ukraine, and each launcher carries 2 missiles, plus they have a reload vehicle with them, which carries 2 more. So automatically they were bringing in 400 launchers into within range of Ukraine. And then if you'd also show the naval preparation slide that we have, if you put that one up next.
Mm-hmm.
So starting in the beginning of this year, they began bringing amphibious assault ships from the Baltic, and we literally tracked them. And at first, Western people would say, "Oh, well, they're going to Venezuela, or they're going," but no, they trucked around. I think it's the other one. Yeah, they ended up coming through the Mediterranean, participating in an exercise in the Mediterranean off of Syria. And one of the reasons the Russians were worried about Syria is they were afraid that the U.S. or NATO might try and hold their forces in Syria hostage. So they then brought additional forces from the Pacific all the way around through the Suez Canal into the Western Mediterranean. And they joined up with the ships then from the Baltic and from the North Sea. And a number of those ships have now gone into the Black Sea. They have at least 8 major combatants with the Karber missile, which gives them another 100 or so launchers aimed at Ukrainian targets with cruise missiles, longer range cruise missiles. The Iskanders go ostensibly 500 kilometers, though we have reason to believe that the Russians lied in terms of the INF treaty, and they actually have a further range. And the Kalibers go out to about 1,200 kilometers. You also notice in this map that the potential attack areas, they've also closed off the Black Sea, the ports of Odessa, and also now block the Sea of Azov. Those arrows there show where their potential amphibious invasions could be. They've already done the one in Sea of Azov, which landed without opposition because the Ukrainians were stretched so thin, and they joined the thrust from Crimea, which I'll show in a minute, headed towards Mariupol. They now have the bulk of their amphibious troops and ships sitting on the west side of Crimea, ready to do an amphibious invasion in the area of Odessa.
But Phil, there were some reports. Of course, we are living in the fog of war, and this one is not an exception. And that there was some small scale landing as well east of Odessa, which was repulsed. Repulsed by the defenders with casualties. So I'm not sure if you heard of this or you have any knowledge.
I've heard that as a rumor. I haven't had that confirmed. Either by the Ukrainians or in other media. So I can't say whether it's there or not. I don't know. I don't know whether that happened. It could have been a reconnaissance unit. They did do something there on the western side of Kherson, on the south side of the Dnieper River. It wasn't clear whether that was an amphibious landing or just some naval reinforcement at that little port to give them in their drive to Kherson or not. But and maybe that's what people are talking about. But I don't know about a failed one. So if we could go to the next slide now, which shows the missile strikes, their initial missile strikes for the first 2 days against Ukrainian targets. So it's very interesting. In terms of how the Russians have sort of described this. Oh, by the way, we know that the war plan, in terms of the chronology, we know that they had a war plan established in January of 2021 that is essentially this war plan being executed now. So this was not something that happened at the last minute. This isn't something that the Ukrainians provoked by some kind of silly comment or something. Now, Putin made it clear a few days ago, the initial operation was called a special military operation. Now, presumably, and the way they describe it, even though it doesn't look like that, but it was the special military operation was designed to demilitarize Ukraine. It was ostensibly focused only on the Ukrainian military. Now, we all know that a lot of civilians got hit, but that's what they said. Now, several days ago, Putin publicly then met with Shoigu, defense minister, and said, okay, the special military operation is now over, and we are now launching a full military operation, which means the entire Ukrainian population, people, everything else is open to. There are no more attempts, even as partial as they were, to minimize civilian casualties. And you're seeing that ever since he made that note. All of a sudden, apartment buildings are being blown apart. Nuclear power plants are being purposely hit. The level of violence has gone up against, and civilian casualties has gone exponential.
Yeah, but Doug, what is your assessment in terms of, because it lasted very short, at least compared to the U.S. Usually U.S. the shock and awe campaigns or something, and also the air cover was limited. What is your explanation of this? That
so first of all, I think I think they're targeting, and they wasted a number of missiles on either bad targets or empty facilities. I don't think they to suppress all of the. So they clearly missed a number of the S-300 air defense sites because the Ukrainians were moving them or putting up phony ones. They hit the Ukrainian airfields very hard, but the Ukrainians have been playing kind of a shell game, moving their aircraft around. And it so happened, I assume, I don't know this for sure, authoritatively, but I assume they were tipped off by perhaps our AWACS that the attack was incoming. So they were able to launch most of their aircraft from their airfields before the first strikes hit the airfields. Mm-hmm. And presumably they went to alternate airfields that weren't, or civilian airfields. So they've been able to keep some air up in the ongoing. There's one Ukrainian pilot who reportedly, confirmed by the Ukrainian military, is a double ace. He shot down 10 Russian aircraft. But their air force is probably down to 10-15% of its assets, as are the air defense missiles now. So this initial missile strike had sort of two waves. The first strike and then the second strike added a lot more targets and a lot more deeper targets. It had its effect. If you sort of imagine that strike compressed and put on Poland, that's they then have almost double redundancy in terms of being able to cover NATO and Polish targets and targets in the Baltics.
Okay.
Now,
and what do you think? How do you? By the way, the preparations, the Ukrainians, did they really initiate some passive measures, like
So let's go, if you would, to the next slide, which is the overall situation slide, and where we are today. And I'll comment on it. So, in essence, we had 5 months worth of warning. The Ukrainians did some basic reactions to their force, but what they had been building their force structure up to 2019 and building their number of forces, but it was very expensive to keep them that many men in active service and so forth. So the new administration came in and feeling like they could save money, and that the threat they faced would be a local threat. It might be in the south, just a drive out of Crimea or in the Donbass, not expecting it to be necessarily a massive 300-degree arc around the whole country. So they took out about 20 to 30% of the manpower of many of the active units and put them in the reserves, under the assumption that they would be called back, but they're recently been in the service and they'd be called back quickly. They took an even higher fraction out of units that, for example, truck transport units or ammunition handling units and so forth. And also some of the assets that would be on airfields to handle dispersal of aircraft, and so a lot of the redundancy. And they put them in the reserves. And there's a lesson, I think, for the West on this. And they also then said, we're going to create a territorial force of 28 brigades. Mm-hmm. And so these territorial brigades are going to be in it was 27 different regions. And now those regions are roughly the average region is roughly the state of the size of the state of Maryland in the United States. So it'd be basically the size of maybe Silesia in Poland. They're fairly big areas, but they didn't set up the territorial brigades with combatant equipment or mobility units. because, or even a command, because they felt like they needed to pass a national law. So their parliament debated it for several months. It was finally enacted on the 1st of January of 2022. So 3 months were lost in setting up the territorials. So they only had the commander. That is an excellent guy. He was one of the Zabrisky's the famous guys, energetic, knows what he's doing, and so forth. So he's trying to set these guys up. So he gets basically one brigade set up, and then they have these other brigades that are kind of be setting up, and maybe they got somebody who's in charge of it. There are places like Kherson where the Kherson area gave up the other day because they didn't have any kind of effective territorial force there. Others are trying to put stuff together, but all they have right now is small stars. So one of the problems, they didn't identify locations within each of those 27 areas of where they would be assigned to the territorials, or secure command, or armories where you could store the equipment. You just can't have these things sitting out in a lot. So now they've been passing out, AK-47s, like they're going out of like sausages. Even bringing back 1910 Maxim machine guns with the little wheels and a steel plate they had they left over from Soviet stocks. And they still work, by the way. But so they're passing this stuff out, but almost no training, no structure. No equipment, and so they're going to try, and I'm sure they'll do as best they can. One of the problems you have, and this is a lesson for NATO and lesson for Poland as you think about your own territorials, is you can get on the horns of a dilemma about mobilization, because as a threat increases, there is a fear that if you start your mobilization, that may actually trigger preemption or earlier attack. And if you're waiting to see if allies will come to help you, if NATO is going to declare this or that, or stuff, it tends to be very inhibiting. And we've seen that historically, how countries has the effect of a surprise attack, even though they've had warning, because they either get accustomed to the threat, or they have trouble dealing with the danger. A classic example, by the way, is the 73 Yom Kippur War, where 20 sometimes the Arabs had mobilized between 67 and 73, and the Israelis counter-mobilized. And finally they go, this is going to be another exercise. It's a religious holiday. We don't have to worry about it. And that's when they said, okay, the Arabs looked at it and said, well, the Israelis aren't reacting, we can hit them. So one has to have a much finer tuned response system than just general mobilization, so that units can be called up, manpower can be fleshed out. So these units, they're not left waiting at the last second. So that's one big issue. Another big issue in Ukraine was cost. So it costs manpower to do it. I gave a very controversial interview in the Ukrainian press 10 days before the war, pleading with them to start. And I said, the cost, the cost of to your budget of having these guys mobilized. I was begging them. It is a fraction of what it is will cost, what a war is going to cost. And now it's pretty freaking obvious, but it's human nature. There was also a tendency to believe, that Ukrainians believe, that the United States, by being so brutally honest about our intelligence, which was very rare, very seldom in the last 70 years has the United States ever been this clear and warning over and over and specific about threats. There was sort of an attitude of, well, the Americans are just going to use that to put pressure on us to give in on political deal, which, by the way, we did not.
That was the argument.
We did not do that. We did not do that. There's a lot of things we did wrong, but that was not one of them. And I believe that is that should not absolve people of their responsibility to secure themselves. and blame us for perfidy when that wasn't the case. But anyway, so that was a reason as well. And so, they began the thing 48 hours, and so there's some units were ready to go. They had taken some precautions. I don't want to say they hadn't done anything. That's not true. But for example, I was on record as saying that the Ukrainians could hold the causeways on Crimea and stack Russians up like Russian bodies up like cordwood. Well, but when I went back and looked at it after events happened, they didn't have the units down there in heavy. They weren't dug in. They didn't have alternate firing positions. They didn't have heavy fire support. They blew through those in hours, and it should have been days, maybe even weeks. Likewise, the drive down the Northeast, people saw that stuff sitting up there. It's cruddy terrain on the west side of the Dnieper and the west side of Kiev up to the Pripyat marshes. But there just wasn't enough force there to hold it. So that ended up being an axis. They did very well. The First Armored Brigade at Chernigov they're still holding on. They've been fighting against the Russian tanks at 10 to 1 odds. They're still doing well. The 30th Brigade.
Phil, it's also very interesting for me. This is some sort of the legendary story probably to come out, the fight of this first brigade. Do you know any details how they've been engaging, and what's their battle plan or something? Can you deduct anything from what you see? This is critically important and very scarcely reported on. And it was holding the whole operational axis of advance towards Kiev from northeast. So it was a critical blocking point. Yeah.
Yes. One of the two, they finally got around them to the very narrow axis, but so I happen to know some of the commanders who were some of the best, most dynamic back from the battles of 2014 and 2015 in particular for the First Brigade. And he'd been brought up to that area. And they also had a reserve armor brigade up there. And I think my impression is that they were able to hold off the attack long enough to get additional reserves up into the reserve armored units, which gave them almost, if it was got enough of them, would give them either replacement crews or double their tank strength. Also, I believe it's one of the key brigades at Sumy has been holding that front back and forth and keeping stuff. What I suggest we'll do is maybe start in the south and just walk around that map so and see what happened and where are we going. So they blew through the causeways in Crimea, and then and actually did a surprising thing because they divided that force. They made a run for the Dnieper River and got to Kherson and were able to seize that bridge over there. So most people sort of thought that the southern thing would be limited on the west side just to opening up the water to Crimea. And that then if they were going to do an east side, it would be along the Sea of Azov to Mariupol. Well, their objectives were much deeper than this. So they took Kherson. The battle went back and forth, but when what was left of the Ukrainian military got pushed out, then there wasn't a territorial force to do it. And you have this situation where the Russians unleashed some fairly heavy hitting it, and the town is undefended other than a few people with small arms, and they're told either surrender or we're going to unleash holy hell on you. And it's easy to blame the guy for surrendering, but all I ask people to do is put them walk in somebody else's shoes in those conditions. And if the opponent is willing to commit essentially mass murder against civilians, indiscriminate attack on civilians, you can't. It's very hard for people not to try to who are more civilized it puts them in a terrible dilemma. Do I keep fighting or do I try to minimize my casualties? Anyway, this attack on the so then they pursued they originally crossed Kherson, and they originally tried to make a sort of double fork, one towards Mykolaiv, and the other on the west side of the Dnieper, sort of the direction of Krivoy Rog or Zaporozhye. That direction seems to have been stopped. So they then gave their focus, and the Russians put an entire division now against the Ukrainian forces there, and it's a tough division. It came from the southern units, and it's got all the fire support, all the stuff, and they're pushing them back. So they pushed them back, and then the attack on the Mykolaiv nuclear power plant was totally gratuitous. There were not Ukrainian forces there. They started hitting with Grads, and then all hell broke loose. And now, so now they're occupying the plant and holding the Ukrainian operators hostage. By the way, they appear to have done the same thing up at Chernobyl.
Yeah, Doc, what did the battle about, of Kherson look like in terms of engagements? Because it seems like big steps, long lines of horizon, bridges, Dnieper River. What did it look like? It was like light infantry battle, or tank engagements.
So again, this isn't eyewitness. I'm like you. I'm looking at it. I'm getting reports from people, but you have advanced group, typically a battalion tactical group, but they're not an advanced guard. They're actually an advanced penetration unit, and they along with reconnaissance guys are trying to figure out and get to places fast. And then when they run into opposition, and if it's too much for them to take, then the command coming back behind them, and this is again the advantage of having a bigger unit with more assets. The commander then says, okay, am I going to try and flank them on one side or the other, or do I have to fight through them? So he tries to outflank them. If he outflanks them, they then have to give up. And remember, these are defenses in hasty positions. They're not, they haven't had time to dig in. They don't have the equipment to dig in. They haven't put in mind all the traditional advantages of a defender, or 90% of them are lost when in these hasty engagements. So the best they can do is sort of try and do ambushes, try and put their tanks in hull defilade, try and surprise the attacker and so forth. He then tries to if he outflanks them, then they have to fall back to another position. Each time they fall back, they take losses. And then he pursues. If they do it right, they kill as good as they lose, or maybe even a higher ratio. And with a bloody nose, the attacker slows down. If he's being successful, he's feeling pretty aggressive. The better he does, the more aggressive he's going to be. The worse he does, the more cautious and slower they drive. So those units down the south appear to have had a lot of success, and they're moving fast. They're now breaking through past Mykolaiv. And the interesting question is whether they turn, and it's not shown on this map, I should have. And so there's two Russian peacekeeping battalions in Transnistria, in eastern Moldova. And that's quote separatist area. Yeah, exactly. Plus there are up to 3 militia brigades of these Transnistrian rebel guys. Apparently those Transnistrian guys are mobilizing, and they're equipped with Russian stockpiled equipment in that area. And they may be, there have been some reports of some of them driving out and harassing Ukrainians, but that may get larger. And it's interesting, this drive from Mykolaiv may actually try and link up with them and cut Odessa in the south completely off before turning south and coming against Odessa. If you also look at the terrain, essentially on a north-south axis, the area is divided by a series of river lines and therefore bridges and so forth. So it's easier to attack Odessa from the north, coming down between rivers than it is to cut across those lines to get behind. And if you go deep enough, it's easier because the rivers are not as steep, and the banks are not as steep, the rivers are not as big, and the areas, then there's a lot more bridges as further inland you go. So that may be their option. There is a large invasion force sitting off of Odessa.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, the famous guys at Snake Island, you see Snake Island at the bottom of the deal, 13 guys, and Russian, I'm sure people have heard the story of the Russian naval guy says, surrender or we're going to blow you away. And they said, go fuck yourself. Did not become the national motto of Ukraine. And by the way, the word F-U-C-K is not pornographic. It stands in English for fornicating under carnal knowledge. It's an acronym.
Nice.
So it is legitimate to use. But anyway, there's now a large amphibious assault force with about 3 to 4 battalion tactical groups available to as the first wave to launch somewhere in the area of Odessa. Landing directly in Odessa is probably not a good idea because it would be expected, but there's enough coastline there that they can probably hit 10 kilometers to the right, 10 kilometers to the left, and have a better chance of succeed, particularly if there's an attack simultaneously coming from behind. And the forces are already depleted. So the next and very serious threat is as the forces are make that right-hand hook in the Kherson region, and now are moving up the east bank of the Dnieper and getting very close to Zaporozhye. Zaporozhye and above it, Dnipropetrovsk, are cities where the majority of the city is on the west bank. So you don't have to seize and control the whole city. All you have to do is cut off the suburbs on a couple key routes, and you basically have kept the Ukrainians from retreating in that area. And that's going to come up as really important in a minute. So then further along the Sea of Azov, so they hit Melitopol, the Ukrainians, there was a battle at Melitopol. I don't know how much the Ukrainians had there and what, but it didn't go well. And so they then drove along the coast road, reinforced it with a landing, an unopposed landing, and hit the east side of Mariupol. And then the 8th Guards Army, which has been the army sitting behind the Donbass, has now hit Mariupol from the east. As I said, they're surrounded by equivalent of 8 or 10 battalion tactical groups. It's a horrific fight. Watch out. Up till now, there hasn't been a lot of pressure by the separatists, who are really Russian proxies, in the Donbass. They've been able to hold the Donbass line pretty much. We'll come up and talk about it in the north along the Sursky River. But that Donbass line, they're dug in. There's 3 lines of entrenchments. They got their artillery. They've been able to hold that. Well, if and when Mariupol falls, and I pray to God it doesn't, but realistically, I don't know how long those Marines can hold on anymore. Then they're in danger of being outflanked in the rear, and that it literally threatens to unzip the whole Donbass line. So at some point, they're going to face a decision. Do we consolidate our forces, say in Volnovakha or further up at Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, and try and create a hedgehog circular defense in the hope that help comes, or we're going to put a last stand in? Or do they say, okay, we need to make a run for it to save the troops and what equipment we can and get across the Dnieper so we can put a better defense in for the west side of the Dnieper? It's going to be a critical decision. And I think they're going to face that shortly.
I expected, Doc, I expected this decision to be made much earlier. Like I think 2 or 3 days ago, even this sort of envelopment was threatening. Yeah, so it turns out that they bought more time, to make this decision. So what would you do? What would you do if you were in their shoes, Phil?
It's easy to say if you don't live in, if you're not, you're talking to a guy in the Cold War who did nuclear planning and put nuclear weapons on 28 Polish bridges on the Vistula. So it's easy to make military comments on somebody else's country. From a military perspective, I'll come back to it towards the end, but they're facing, so from a military perspective, you want to try and save as much of your force as you can, and also try to save at least some part of your country so that you don't have a government in exile, you have a government in part of your country at least, because then you have the hopes of rebuilding and a future when you're defeated in detail and there is no army left, and the government is forced to flee or died in place. Then it's far easier for the occupier to put in puppets and basically establish their new conquest area. So if it was me, I would pull out. I would wait till the fight for Mariupol is over, or because I know Solo, he is going to fight to the last guy. But when they can't hold, and when they send their last message out, then it's time. I would start pulling out. In the meantime, I would start pulling out some of the heavy artillery that they have there. They have large ammunition stocks. They have air defenses. One of the problems, if they start running, those roads are going to be filled with refugees.
Yeah. And aircraft hanging up.
And aircraft can come down those roads and strafing the refugees and the troops, and it's an absolute nightmare. So there's a pretty good second tertiary road net in the east, and so if you have time, you'd like to use that. So if it was me, I would start getting those. I wouldn't abandon until I know Mariupol is gone, but then I would get the guys. Try and put a defense line in, south of Zaporozhye, and slowly pull the guys from Sloviansk up to Kharkiv, and try and at least put in a resistance. There's some good terrain you can sort of see on the map, some dark areas, which are part of the Seversky River line. You give up some territory, but try and restabilize a line sort of anchored on the Sloviansk, Donetsk, Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, and try to hold on the Zaporizhia. If you have reserve forces anywhere, you're going to want to start, but at least put something in front of Dnipropetrovsk. As we go up the line on the Seversky River, which is where the Donbass area ends, you might want to point that out to your viewers. So the dark area of the Donbass is the Seversky River, right? Top of that, right there. Yeah, that's it. You're there. So the Ukrainians have been holding that. They backed off a little bit, but those units have been doing really well. And that's good news. So that provides the potential sort of stabilizing a gradual withdrawal. And when you do that sort of what works really effective, particularly against Russian tactics, is called an active defense. And you engage them and take your hits, and then fall back another 4 or 5 kilometers. And hit them again. If you have enough force, you want the guys in the second line to already be preparing their positions, so the guys in the first line fall back and become a third line. And then when the second line is puts in their hits, then they fall back and become a fourth line. And you keep doing this back and back and back, and you can inflict losses on the attacker 2-3 times what you can. On the other hand, every engagement you lose some, so eventually you kind of run out of guys. But as a very effective technique, and the Ukrainians seem to be pretty good with it. If we had gotten a fraction of the javelins that are being now into these guys, to my knowledge, they haven't gotten any additional javelins anywhere along this line east of Dnieper, which is just criminal because they could be putting in such a terrific defense with that and with some stinger. And that is that cross of shame is on us. As an American, I find it absolutely humiliating.
Yeah, according to the reports that I received today in the morning in Warsaw time, and we are recording it on, by the way, for you to know, on the 4th of March, evening Ukrainian time. I just received the information from the field, from the western part of Ukraine, that the javelins and other ATGMs and the anti-tank launchers are arriving in bulk, in real numbers, but the distributed mostly to this new units composed of older soldiers that cannot operate them well because they used RPG during their service in the military, but still that they are engaging in this Kiev region like hell right now, the Russians. Yeah, but I have received no reports from the east of the Dnieper river line how the distribution network is still working, or if it's working at all.
It just wasn't enough time, and enough. But anyway, Kharkiv. The Russians, I believe, up till 2 days ago, were basically kind of playing with Kharkiv. That's essentially the 20th Guards Army there, and I think they were kind of trying to encircle it. So the Russians want so that was under when they were quote doing anti-military. By the way, in Putin's speech, his last big speech about Ukraine, he made some interesting comments. He specifically mentioned the defense industries of Kharkiv, particularly the Kharkiv tank plant and the Antonov aircraft plant. He mentioned Uzmash missile plant in Dnipropetrovsk and Mykolaiv shipbuilding, which, by the way, was shipbuilding was the biggest shipbuilding facility in the old Soviet Union. And Kharkiv tank plant was the second largest tank plant. And the Uzmash, when I first arrived in 2014 in Ukraine, I was visiting the plant, the missile plant in Dnipropetrovsk, and there was a Russian ICBM sitting there waiting for the Ukrainians to put their guidance package on, because Russia had been their largest purchase. 40% of the Ukrainian defense industry was supplying Russia. So it's interesting. So I doubt seriously whether he's going to bomb the Antonov plant in the Kharkiv. If I was Ukrainian, I think I would put a lot of explosives and just and make sure that he doesn't get that. But now it appears that they're changing from this sort of toying with the Kharkiv. So this idea of humanitarian civilian corridors. So it's in there now. Now they want to produce as many casualties as possible. First of all, casualties create chaos in the rest of the country. They clog up the roads and so forth. Secondly, it gets them out of it allows them to then do whatever they want to. So they basically are under the assumption that the people who hate Russians are going to leave, and the people who either can't or are old and infirm who can't leave, or those who are pro-Russian, or those who are willing to try to get along no matter what, are going to stay behind. So they're going to be far less of a resistance threat. So you want to get the people who are your likely resistance crowd out and running. And so sure enough, we got now this supposed agreement on refugee quarters, which is just going to accelerate that. Now, you can't blame the Ukrainians for doing that. I mean, it's women and children, for Pete's sake, but it's fueling the thing. I participated in a NATO study a few years ago, which looked at what might happen in a Russian invasion of Ukraine. And a lot of it is sort of playing out. But anyway, we had estimated, that study had estimated 10 million refugees. And most of us thought that that was too high and kind of the maximum. Well, the current flow
10 million, yeah.
to 10 million ending up on the Polish, but 10 million, most of them ended up on the Polish border. The flow rate that we had identified has actually been exceeded this week. In other words, we saw a certain rise in we give a certain estimate of the refugee flow, and it's actually accelerating that almost by a factor of 2.
Just for you to know, and for the especially American audience that might be listening to us, is I'm sitting now in Warsaw, Poland, while I understand Phil is sitting close to the DC area in US, and there is almost 1 million already refugees, Ukrainian refugees in Poland. So, for example, a friend of mine was coming over to Warsaw today, and he couldn't find a hotel accommodation at all.
Right.
So even it's not only that they use the hostels and other schools that the Polish government is offering. It's like, everybody's helping here. The people are driving them. It's really an exodus of people, and even the hotel, even fancy hotels are being taken. So, and it's only 1 million, close to 1 million, about that.
And you have, so people have been sort of criticizing, oh, well, why are the lines 30 kilometers long? Why are it taking so long to process them? And so I go, wait a minute. You can't just open the gates and let millions of people mob your country. I mean, and what are they going to do when they're there? They don't have transportation. They don't have living. I mean, so you have on the other countries, Romania, Slovakia, and God knows what Hungary's doing. I'm not a big fan, obviously. Of how they're handling this, but that is an overload. So what's likely to happen is you're going to end up with some multiple of millions, essentially in the Lviv, Yavoriv area, concentrated, but primarily women and children. No more food than they can bring with them. So within a couple of days, they're going to be literally starting to starve. No protection against the environment, no warmth, no tents, no medical assistance. The number of wounded who are going to be coming there is going to increase exponentially as the people are getting out of cities that are under attack, and no security. So they could be prey to not only just normal criminals who take advantage of this, but any kind of Russian agents or sympathizers or people trying to create anarchy. It's a horrific condition, and I was going to wait and address this later, but this is I think the time to do it now. So the Ukrainians have been begging for a no-fly zone, and it's not going to happen. In my opinion, it's not going to happen for 3 reasons. One reason is that we do not have aircraft. So a no-fly zone requires constant presence, otherwise to engagements. You have to have enough aircraft to be able to sustain aircraft over that 24 hours, day in, day out. We do not have enough bases or aircraft in the vicinity to be able to do that. Okay, so to be able to do that even over Kiev, let alone southern and eastern Ukraine. So they're out of reach for those areas. Secondly, no-fly zone involves a set of orders that say you will shoot down, you will actively engage any aircraft entering it. So when you go in, you're not just flying around or trying to keep them out. Your guidance to your military, under U.S. and NATO standards, are engaging them directly. And then politically, and so that then results in people say, wait a minute, we want to help, but we don't want to start World War III. So there's an alternative, and that is to declare the area. If you show that, we'll come back to it. If you show the slide that I have with the white line on it,
Yeah.
we declare the area between Zhytomyr and Vinnytsia on that north-south line, which as of now, there are no Russian troops west of that line. If we essentially declare Western Ukraine a refugee-free zone, that is a refugee-secure zone, and say, okay, we are going to put, we don't want to engage Russian troops. There are no Russian troops that far there. We want to put in peacekeepers, and we want to put air protection over them. Air cover for peacekeepers, it does not the same rules of engagement as no-fly zone. And we can definitely reach there, not just from Poland, but from a number of other NATO areas, just so that one country isn't to carry the buck. So that is a doable thing, and I believe we ought to start discussing it. So
but you were telling me over the phone that there is already a group, with some, prominent people that is soliciting for that, or I misunderstood.
So my colleagues, General Breedlove, former NATO commander of Air Force, General Wesley Clark, former NATO commander, former U.S. presidential candidate, we're pushing that. Myself pushing that very hard. It would not hurt to have allies also pushing it as well. And here's a fundamental issue. At the end of World War II, people said, oh, 6 million Jews died. If only we would have known, we would have done something, but we didn't know. So it wasn't an excuse. Oh, Warsaw Uprising, oh, it was valiant effort, but we just couldn't get there in time. We just couldn't get stuff there. And of course, the Russians sat there and watched it happen. We're no better than those Russian guys sitting on the other side of the Vistula or the Warsaw. If we sit and let this happen, we are no better. We have no excuse to say, oh, we didn't see it coming. There are the potential of millions of civilians, mostly women and children, whose lives are going to be at risk. And how can we watch this happen with such cowardice? We don't have an excuse.
Yeah, maybe the argument is that it will be very escalatory, right? And how to negotiate with the Russians, this thing.
So it'll be escalatory if Russia attacks Poland and you resist. I mean, there is a point. So already there's a Romanian aircraft that disappeared over the Black Sea, Estonian ship that's been sunk off of Odessa. When really, we are going to sit and watch millions of refugees?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of how the discussion is happening in Warsaw and Poland, and Poles are all in favor of that, but we think that it's more of the NATO and the Western allies that are reluctant to take any risk, actually.
So you guys have to do what you have to do, and I understand it. Nobody can expect Poland or the Baltics or to take on a nuclear power. One thing that should be a wake-up call, though, in Putin's last address, about Ukraine, he also talked about bringing back the Russian, that it was legitimate to have the Russian Empire. And it's very specific. He was even critical of Lenin and the communist creating state. And so when you look at the map that he was using to describe the area that is quote Russia, and he wants to restore either by occupying or by having tutelage.
Yeah, I found some map here. You know,
it includes not only Belarus, not only Ukraine, but Finland, half of Poland. Are you kidding me? I mean, it's and at some point, it ought to be the people in those areas' interest to defend themselves. So if we can, let's go back to the map, and I'll try and wrap it up in terms of sort of going around. But I think I'd like to conclude then with sort of the implications, I think, for Poland and the Baltic.
But if you say a few words about the Kiev front as well, just what would you expect there?
Yeah, if it's all right, I'm starting in Kharkiv. I left off in Kharkiv, so I expect them to start hitting Kharkiv very very heavily and try and get, but possibly leave a refugee outlet, so it clogs up the roads and stuff. The area north of that at Sumy, so Sumi's gone back and forth, and Sumy itself is not critically important, but it sits right next to a major highway that is the key to the area. So the Ukrainians have sort of been able to hold parts of Sumy, but the bypass highway to the north side of it, the Russians seem to be using. And that shaded area, by the way, the shaded area on this map does not mean that the Russians control or occupy all of that area and control everything. What it means is that there is no active military opposition left in that area. So there aren't any Ukrainian main force units in those areas to oppose Russian movement and so forth. So, and if in the process of map, by the way, these maps have appeared every few days in the online edition of the Wall Street Journal worldwide that we're providing them. So you can sort of track them. But when I bring this map up to tomorrow's date, the area of what's the First Guards Tank Army, which is just to the north of Sumy, that's the force that's moving laterally to Kiev, and its lead elements have reached the suburb right there exactly. The majority of those prongs, not the southern one, but those three big prongs there, exactly where your cursor is, and then back to the border. That area now needs to be shaded. And one of those prongs is now churning south along the Dnieper, exactly where your pointer is, and obviously going to head south to try to close off some more of the crossing points of Dnieper. As we get to
it's a very dangerous development, right?
Yeah.
Phil.
And the First Guards Tank Army is bringing with it the TOS 1 and 2. Multiple launch flamethrower that fires flamethrowing rockets out 7 kilometers or so. They're bringing the 203 long range guns, which can fire 40 kilometers. They are bringing the 240 millimeter heavy mortar, which they used, by the way, in 2015. 14-15 on the battles of Luhansk and the Battle of Donetsk airports. It fires a 240 millimeter shell in its mortar, and it comes down and can penetrate the ground 3 floors deep. And additional Iskander units that will be in range more to the west. So those forces are all coming in that direction. It's interesting that the TOS flamethrower units are in what's called nuclear, biological, chemical regiments. These are regiments that have a weapons of mass destruction designation. The 152 Mista self-propelled gun that the First Guards Tank Army also has 50 of or so. The 203 gun, the 240 mortar, and obviously the Iskander are all dual capable. That is, the Russians have tactical nuclear warheads for those systems. It's interesting at the early 90s, after INF treaty and everybody Soviet Union was collapsing, we and the Russians had this verbal agreement, a mutual unilateral reduction in tactical nuclear weapons. We got rid of everything except for 300. We got rid of 7,000 tactical nuclear weapons and got the inventory down to 300, which are air delivered and haven't been modernized, and maybe half of those are potentially stored in NATO countries. The Russians had 20,000. They brought their inventory down to several thousand, but in the last 20 years, they've modernized with additional 2,000 low-yield tactical nuclear weapons that can be fired from the artillery or fired from their S-400, S-500 air defense missiles, and also ship torpedoes, ASW, and also air-delivered cruise missiles. So there is a nuclear potential. I'm not saying the Russians are going to do it. There are a whole bunch of reasons that they might not. Sanity might prevail. They wouldn't do it, but that's not a threat to be just ignored. So the battle for Kiev. There's no shortage of troops, of men with small arms in Kiev. And the Russians can, if you look at some of the destruction that they've been of the towns to the west of it, where they just literally obliterated 7-story apartment buildings because somebody fired some shots out of them. This idea of civilian resistance, oh, you're gonna take a shot at a tank, or as they drive by, you're gonna throw a Molotov cocktail. Well, if the other side doesn't care about human beings, they just turn around and they don't have to look for you. They don't have to chase you. They just take out the building and everybody in it that you're there. And they're trying to send a message: don't do it. I don't think it's going to stop the Ukrainians, but it's bloody awful. So the question is whether they're going to create a humanitarian withdrawal area out of Kiev or not. There's still tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of civilians in Kiev, and not to mention on the east side on Kiev, of the emperor, whether the Ukrainians are going to try and blow the bridges, and how long that's going to go on.
By the way, Doc, just as far as I remember, you were investigating the Yom Kippur War, yes, and those yes, tank engagement and stuff. So, what do you think about the intensity of warfare? Is it bigger, more than it was during the Yom Kippur War? Will it be a new benchmark after the Second World War, or is it like in a different battlefield? How would you compare those two?
So in some ways, it seems like a slow-moving campaign, but that's because we're when you look at the
distances,
when you look at the distances involved, this is actually and also seems sort of small. We talk about specific towns. This is the largest area and the largest military campaign since the Second World War. What we found even in the battles at Debaltseve in 2015 was that so we were surprised in the Yom Kippur War that we'd assumed that artillery consumption rates were about 100 rounds per tube per day. In the Yom Kippur War, that we were shocked because it virtually doubled, in some cases even more than that. What we saw in Ukraine is it doubled again. It was up to 400 rounds per tube per day. I mean, they're burning out tubes. So they actually had spare troops sitting next to the artillery pieces because you were firing so much. So that level of intensity is very high, and ammunition, and because now that means that after a while, so you need much heavier stocks than most people have, and also the logistics for moving them. The armored battles are pretty much the same as we saw in the 73 war. The loss rates are much higher than normal Western planning, at least up to recent years. Is the loss of infantry vehicles, BTRs, BMPs is horrific on both sides. And when an infantry vehicle is hit, the Ukrainian troops call them iron coffins. Everybody inside tends to go with the vehicle and burn up. So there is and very few countries except Israel have been, and now Russia with their new design, even though I don't think they've even fielded one yet. But other than Israel, people have been very slow to recognize Western, particularly Western armies, particularly NATO armies, been very slow to recognize the need to have a heavy infantry vehicle that is as protected as the main battle tank. Also, increasingly, there's a need to take and not put a full 12-man squad or 10 or 12-man squad in one vehicle, but separate them into to two vehicles. So you have a fire team in each vehicle. That's expensive, but it is increasingly obvious in terms of the battlefield. Minefields, prepared defenses still work. Detonating bridges. So one of the problems, and NATO has this too, one of the problems is you can't wait until the war starts to start doing your field engineering. You need to have engineers pre-chamber bridges, every bridge, prior to the conflict. You need to have people go through and decide how much explosive it has to go into this chamber to take this bridge out. Who's going to have it? Whose responsibility is it? What stage of mobilization before the conflict is somebody going to go and put that? Because if you wait till the conflict, it's very likely that the guys may not get there, and all you to cross a river obstacle, all you have to have is 1 out of 5 bridges survive, and the guys find it and they run, and they then collapse your defense. So I think those are very important lessons that we need to address. And the problem is it's very hard in peaceful countries in peacetime to put in prepared defenses or to have the engineering assets so you can do it rapidly in a crisis mode, to have arrangements with farmers' fields and other places that you can put in minefields if you have to, even before the shooting starts. Let alone have the the amount of engineers and the pre-assessment of how much is needed and who's going to do what to when. Have that all prepared ahead of time. Most countries do not have that, and you cannot wait until the conflict starts.
Yeah.
So how long can Kiev hold on? That battle, depending on how much the Ukrainians want to suffer and how much the Russians want to blow up. The battle for Kiev, sadly, can go on for another week, 10 days, till they blow everything up and kill everything in the town. The Russians can try to do man-to-man, street-to-street fighting, and they may, they feel like at a certain point they can get in and, but I think it's sort of past their point where they think that they're going to get Ukraine to surrender or a replacement government. Somebody step in.
It's not going to be peaceful. It's not good. Transition is not going to be peaceful anymore.
I don't think so.
I have 2 questions, pertaining to that, Doc. So, does the equation that you are referring to, that it's going to collapse, is changed somehow by the fact that the mobilization effort is in full swing, and the Ukrainians will be having large numbers of the military, of course without vehicles and stuff, but in terms of the manpower, there is no short of manpower. Does it change this equation or your prediction in any respect? And how would you employ those forces, the numbers of the people, the manpower that apparently is coming into ranks?
So most of those guys, territorials, are going to want to stay and defend their own city. And
So will the battlefield transition to more dispersal or even insurgency mode?
So the ones that are, so there's, what I would do versus what's likely to happen. So if it was me, I would take the territorials from cities that aren't in immediate harm's way and get them to cities that you have to hold. So I would be, trucking and training and busing in guys from the West to try to reinforce Zaporozhye and Dnepropetrovsk and the other crossing points on the Dnieper. But I doubt that that's going to happen, in part because they don't have the assets, and it doesn't do any good just to send guys with little, with their small AK-47s and no other heavy equipment. So in most cases, they're going to try and defend their area, but they're individually isolated areas. And because they don't have mobility, they can't really engage except in some of the bigger cities. And as this thing wears on and more cities become blown away, and there's a point where people just go, this is futile. I think setting up this zone, what this showed in the previous map, the Zhytomyr-Vinnytsia line, and starting to get assets back there, and starting digging in along that line, getting people in front of it and behind it, organized, is really important. Likewise, the Belarusians and those Russian armies, there's 4 Russian armies sitting there north of that. 3 of them haven't been committed: the 5th, the 29th, and the 35th, plus Belarusian elite special forces and air assault brigade guys.
Yeah, but still, there are reports, and you also mentioned that 90%. That 90% of the Russian, manpower units were already engaged in Ukraine. So how does that, work with this, reserve units that they still have behind the Belarusian border?
So those there's at least 15 or so battalion tactical groups, Russians that are sitting there and haven't been committed yet. I assume that but one of 2 things: either the Russians anticipated and saying, okay, we're going to let the Ukrainian, we're not going to carry the fight into Western Ukraine. There was an argument back in 2014 that some Russians were making, that they said, well, we just want the east side of the Dnieper, and we want the southern part where is some Russian population, but we're going to let the West, and we want Kiev neutralized, but the western part, they can be part of NATO, we don't care. So there was quite a bit of Russian narrative. There was even some Russian feelers to some NATO countries saying, hey, do you guys want, this piece of Ukraine or not? Generally, people said, hell no. So that could be one Russian rationale. My impression is, and that's why they haven't attacked that area so far. But given what Putin's statement is repeatedly, he wants all of Ukraine, and the last thing he wants to do is have an area of resistance. I think it's a matter of time. He given his limited force, he wants to take the east up to the Dnieper, then swing up from the south in the direction of Kiev, and then then about somewhere in there is when they're going to turn and hit the west side. So when whatever's left is in the west is facing the threats from the east, that's when they're going to hit those guys behind them from Belarus. So those are sort of two variants, if you will, and a lot of things in between. But so right now, I would not assume that those guys aren't potentially playing, and I wouldn't assume that they are not a severe threat, because you're only secure as to the extent that you can defend those axes are not thick, but if they're not heavily defended, and suddenly they're running wild. Coming down essentially south they don't have to seize every city. They just cut the rail lines, cut the road lines, in and around Lviv, and head south of Carpathians. All of a sudden, Ukraine is basically, and eventually between Transnistria and the west, they'll eventually close off Ukraine in the south. That'll be sort of the last thing if they. I'm talking about the southern Carpathians in Romania, but so those are your two options. I hate to say it, but the immortal words of Forrest Gump, that's about all I have to say about that. I'm happy if we haven't taken too much time to talk about the implications for Poland.
Go ahead.
We can do that another time.
Let's just try to start it, maybe at least. That's going to be, for sure interesting for the audience.
Yeah. So some key points, but between having taken so much of your time and endurance already, and my throat, sore. I'll just hit what I think the major points are. One is, if the Russians end up occupying Ukraine, some people say, "Oh, how can they occupy it? Because it's it's such a big area and it takes so many." They don't have, the Russian system, going back to the commissars, have a very efficient and brutal method of controlling large populations. And I would not assume that they're not going to end up being able to control the whole area. Does that mean there won't be a risk? No, there will be a resistance. Does that mean people won't be? Absolutely. But and people say, "Oh, well, these resistance movements work." Yeah, they work after 20 or 30 years, and they work because the occupier gets tired of it. Resistance movements do not by themselves overthrow occupiers. As Mao Zedong said, you have three stages. You have your resistance stage, you have your selective attack stage, and then you convert that into main force units who take the offensive. And resistance movements by themselves, if they don't have sanctuaries, if they don't have access to supplies, very seldom are able to overthrow an occupier, unless they just make their life so miserable, but cumulatively over years and years of harassment, that they give up and quit. So don't assume that there's not going to be, if the Russians take Western Ukraine, take all of Ukraine, that there's not going to be Russian armies sitting on the western border of Ukraine, tank army and a combined arms army. And there'll be another tank army, another combined arms army likely sitting in Western Belarus. That quadruples the threat to Poland.
Yeah, of course.
And we're going to have to address that, both the United States, NATO, and Poland. It also poses a severe threat to the Baltic. There are offensive things we can do. We're going to need to think about how to have a people's liberation. One of the things that Ukraine is showing, that really since Warsaw resistance, this is the first time a country in the West has actually been launching a people's war, a true people's war. And we also need to think about how to launch liberation movements for Ukraine, liberation movement to make Lukashenko pay for his perfidy and aggression out of Belarus, liberation movements to restore Georgia to what it ought to be and get the Russian occupiers out of those areas. There's no reason now that we have to stay on the pure defensive, but politically and in terms of sub-rose activity. I'm not saying start a formal war. We need to realize that the world stage, the world literally has tilted on its axis. This is an entire new world we're facing. In other words, it is as dramatic as going from the Cold War to what I call the interregnum, and now both in Europe and in Asia, we have two revisionist powers who are determined to reestablish areas or establish areas beyond their current borders, Russia in Eastern Europe and China in the first island chain, specifically Taiwan, but potentially the Philippines and other places as well. And they're now together. They're co-conspiring. They're equipping. The Russians are equipping them. The Chinese are paying the Russians. So we're facing a very different world than we did 2 weeks ago, and we haven't gotten our hands around it yet. We haven't gotten around to how do you even negotiate with these guys who've broken every single treaty? How do you actually talk to these people or have any kind of agreements with them who commit essentially genocide? I mean, if you really read Putin's carefully, he's essentially denying the right of Ukraine to have its own state. It is a form of national genocide. No, I'm not necessarily saying he wants to kill every person, but he's denying the right, and ostensibly that applies to Eastern Poland and the Baltics and Finland as well. We have to come to grips with that. I think we have to also think about a much more efficient form of defense, particularly for the frontline states of Baltic and Poland. We're going to have heavier NATO forces. We're going to have a missile air defense belt that covers the whole Baltic, all the way up into Sweden, Finland if they want it, all the way down past Poland. Poland should not be the only ones with Patriot. And we need to put it in depth. We're going to need to have active NATO forces assign positions in Eastern Poland, have assets available that can get there, have plans that as crises escalate or their behavior escalates, they move an army up, they do this, they do that, then we are matching it piece by piece by piece. Every step they do, we have a matching. We don't wait for mobilization. We don't wait for NATO to declare, article this, article that. No, it's a step-by-step agreement. It's not going to be with all NATO. That's silly. It just gives the lowest common denominator to give a veto. So it has to be an agreement between those who are willing and those who realize the problem, and we get it done. I think it puts a whole new premium on territorial forces. I know you and your colleagues have been working on it in Poland. I applaud it. I encourage you. And we need to really think that through on how to organize them and how to equip them and how to train them, and also the time sequencing to being able to call them up and exercise them that makes it possible in conditions of various states of warning and alert. So those would be the highlight points, I think. Oh, and one last one.
Yeah.
NATO turned down nuclear modernization recently, any idea of putting missiles on NATO territory, and we're going to have to rethink that. And it's not popular, but you can't. Remember, Putin said that one of the reasons he was going in was to foreclose that going to Ukraine. He's going to do the same thing, the same argument against NATO. So right now we better get ready. And we better prepare. Whether we're doing it offshore or how we're going to do it, ship launch, there's a number of submarines, but we have got to increase the NATO nuclear threat. You cannot depend on a couple of hundred B-61 air-delivered tactical bombs on a handful of NATO aircraft, NATO airfields as the NATO deterrent. And so we're going to have to seriously think that one through as well.
I think it's a good moment to pause at least our conversation and to make another round after a few days, maybe when more developments will have occurred.
May I say in closing how much I have many friends in Poland. Been my honor to know a number of your military people, and say how much I personally admire your willingness to stand firm, your willingness to do everything you can to help Ukraine. You're in the forefront of doing the right thing within NATO, and it's shame on them for not following you. And to the Polish people, I take my hat off and literally bow in humility to thank you for everything that you're doing.
For sure, a lot of Poles will be listening to those words and hearing those words. Actually, that's for sure. Thank you very much, Phil. Yes, Phillip Karber, Dr. Phillip Karber was our guest today at Strategy and Future. My name is Jacek Bartosiak, and please stay with us for more episodes. Thank you.